Who is arguably the greatest human or even living being to ever live? Story 1. Going with James Harrison, a.k.a. the man with the golden arm. Dude was an Aussie blood plasma donor whose plasma contained antibodies against RHD. His plasma was used in making a treatment for rhesus disease. Because of this, he made over 1,100 blood donations, saving the lives of 2.4 million babies. Story 2. Jonas Salk, polio vaccine, and Alexander Fleming, penicillin, are responsible for two of the most impactful medical advances of the 20th century. Rather than immediately seeking patents, they shared their findings with the entire scientific community so that they could be developed further and utilized to the benefit of mankind. Fleming was famously furious when others patented methods of penicillin production, saying, "I found penicillin and have given it free for the benefit of humanity. Why should it become a profit-making monopoly?" Answer: I see these posts so often and the comments are always the same. This is the first comment that's really hit home with me, and this is now what I would do. Before I get a lawyer, financial advisor, and not tell anyone, yada, yada, yada. Answer: not really. The only problem at the time was the huge-scale bioreactors at the time were kind of a pipe dream. So initial thoughts on penicillin was that it was promising but not interesting because scientists were simply concerned how they could scale up production in any meaningful way. Keep in mind, back when it was first attempted to be used as a usable medicine, it apparently was really exhaustive just to get a few dosages. True story. It took from March to June 1942 to make enough penicillin to treat 10 patients. 10! But the moment large-scale deep tank reactors became an option, millions of doses were able to be made in 1943 and then billions by 1945, just 3 years after not having proper production pipelines. Countries believed in it. The U.S. even fast-tracked its development to have antibiotics on the ready for the invasion of Normandy and WW2 in general. But it was just the initial hump of, how do we go from small fungal cultures to huge tanks and refined purification? That made people a little skeptical. But not because of the science behind it. The scientific community seemed pretty much on board with it because it had both in vitro and in vivo bactericidal efficacy. Source: I am a biologist. Story 3. My grandfather never smoked or drunk alcohol, never swore or raised his voice to anyone, religious even though I'm not. The most consistent man I've met, he never judged anyone, treated everyone with respect. And from what I heard from his children, was a wonderful father who raised them without ever hitting them or yelling. As a grandfather, I only have wonderful memories of him, the best role model who I can never hope to emulate. My father died before I was 2, and he became the male role model of my life. He brought a new suite for my wedding even though he was over 90. He's been dead for 34 years and I still think of him and miss him. Story 4. Norman Borlaug. Answer: to save folks a click, through agricultural research he developed high-yield, disease-resistant wheat varieties and some of their agricultural production techniques which could be used around the world, especially in poorer nations. Borlaug was often called the father of the Green Revolution, 6-7, and is credited with saving over 1 billion people worldwide from starvation, 839, 10, 11, 12, according to Jan Douglas, executive assistant to the president of the World Food Prize Foundation. The source of this number is Greg Easterbrook's 1997 article, Forgotten Benefactor of Humanity. The article states that the form of agriculture that Borlaug preaches may have prevented 1 billion deaths. 13. Dennis T. Avery also estimated that the number of lives saved by Borlaug's efforts to be 1 billion a 12. In 2009, Josette Sheeran, then the executive director of the World Food Program, stated that Borlaug saved more lives than any man in human history. 14. He was awarded the 1970 Nobel Peace Prize in recognition of his contributions to world peace through increasing food supply. Story 5. Sir Francis Bacon and Descartes. Dudes invented the modern scientific thought process. Most of the on this list would have been impossible without their insistence that science not be based upon assumed ideas of how reality works. They removed confirmation bias and the fallacy of assumption from the scientific process and allowed dogma to be ignored in favor of experimental data. Story 6. Alexander Fleming. He's that guy you learned about in high school whose name everyone always forgets. The dude who accidentally discovered penicillin because he forgot his sandwich. Later on, when he found parts of it were covered in mold and parts where there was none at all, he realized what happened, that something was killing the mold. When he shared the discovery with the world, he essentially became the father of modern medicine. That one single accidental discovery has probably saved more lives than anyone else in history as far as I'm aware of. Story 7. Probably the first person who figured out coffee. I mean, they single-handedly saved Mondays and gave humanity a reason to get out of bed for centuries. Without them, we'd all still be staring blankly at walls. Truly, a hero among us. Answer. I'm going to get crucified for this, but the only reason people need coffee to save their mornings is because they've been drinking it for too long. It's a plain garden variety addiction. Our bodies don't need a substance to wake up. That grumpiness and fog before you have your coffee is because you've made your body dependent. Story 8. I vote Carl Sagan. His philosophies and commitment to educating the general population on the workings of the modern era is genuinely important and should not be overlooked. Without people like him, and arguably more importantly, people listening to him, we end up with future idiocracy. Story 9. Jesus. Answer. There will probably end up being some comments from the anti-religion crowd in response to this one. As an agnostic, I'll say this. It's generally agreed by both religious and secular groups that Jesus was an actual human being, godlike powers aside. He was obviously responsible for the rise of Christianity, which a lot of people have problems with today, but generally because of Christians who don't even follow the actual teachings of Jesus. Theocratic dickbags wrongfully used and continue to use Christianity to justify all kinds of bull, hatred, wars, etc. Some of us are fortunate to know people who do emulate the teachings of Jesus, and they're genuinely great people. If you look at what Jesus actually said, it's generally not the things people Christianity over nowadays. Even as a non-believer, I'll still say there are a lot of very based red words regarding being non-judgmental, humble, generous, kind, etc., etc., etc. Jesus was reportedly the kind of human who did interact with the lowest of the low people nobody else would associate with, and washed their feet as a sign of respect, so on and so forth. This is actually a good answer to OP's question, even from a secular standpoint. Story 10 depends what you mean by great. Genghis Khan or Alexander the Great were great at conquering. Guys like Jesus or Muhammad have entire segments of the globe talking about their teachings daily. People like Socrates or Aristotle are the foundation of entire schools of philosophy. Guys like Newton solved the natural world as an afterthought. And the list goes on. Someone invented fire. Someone invented the wheel. Someone domesticated animals. Story 11. Since most scholars agree he existed, you could make an argument for Jesus Christ, even if you don't believe his claim to divinity, to be able to preach a message of pure, unconditional love that's so powerful and inspiring that it influences whole civilizations for 2,000 years is pretty great. Story 12. A lot of research suggests that we give too much credit to people who invent things, thinking that without them, we wouldn't have invention XYZ or WVIR. Most current research suggests that it's the maturation of underlying technology that often spurs innovation. So I'm inclined to give this award to someone outside of technology or new inventions. Probably this award should go to someone like the earlier mention of Fred Rogers, someone who helped educate people on emotional maturity and affected people while young and impressionable, though this person would more likely be from India or China than the US just based on population size and opportunity to make contact with them. Answer. An interesting point. I wonder if you could make a similar one with men like Fred Rogers. He didn't exist in a vacuum. His values and his personality were shaped by his family, friends, role models, and society he grew up in. In a sense, he stood on the shoulders of giants just as scientists do, and perhaps those environmental conditions would have eventually produced another Fred Rogers if he hadn't existed. But the thing that he shares with those inventors is that both worked tireless for years, devoting themselves to a cause that made the world better. Maybe that's what really counts. Story 13. I believe Johannes Gutenberg is the most influential person in history. Without his invention of the printing press, the dissemination of knowledge on a large scale wouldn't have been possible. Many of the other figures mentioned, while incredibly important, might not have had the same impact if their ideas couldn't have been shared so widely and efficiently. In many ways, Gutenberg made all of the others possible. Story 14, M. Gut reaction, Galileo. He showed us, literally, that we aren't the center of the universe and was punished for it. Almost everyone listed here had some profound accomplishment that you have to think would have been done anyway. They were just the first. Story 15. Copernicus has to share the stage with him. Copernicus was the first to propose a heliocentric model of the solar system, but both Galileo and Copernicus had their explanations validated by Tycho Brahe. So really they all need to share the stage together, an Italian, a Pole, and a Dane. Sounds like the beginning of a bad joke, but very good science. Story 16. Henrietta Lacks. Her cells that were harvested without her knowledge, a rare, very fast-growing cancer, are in an uncountable number of labs throughout the world, in petri dishes being used for research to help mankind in every area of disease and in many other ways. The poor lady died young and never knew how ubiquitous her cells would be. Many have profited from her, and she never saw any of the money, just the tragedy of dying. Story 17, Rafi. If you don't know his name, you probably know his work. He wrote songs like Baby Beluga, Banana Phone, and many others. He popularized other songs like Down by the Bay. If you know these songs, it's most likely because he brought them to the mainstream in the 80s and 90s. He never sold out. He could have made millions selling his likeness and his songs for marketing. He could have slapped his face on lunchboxes, trinkets, W-Word junk for parents to buy. But he didn't want a bunch of plastic Rafi merch to rot in landfills for thousands of years. He has used his influence to address climate change, bullying, child exploitation, and a number of other causes, all while continuing to entertain kids and be a good guy. The guy is a global treasure. The world would be so much better if we had more guys like Rafi. Story 18, Norman Borlaug, geneticist and agricultural scientist that was a major figure in the Green Revolution. His contributions to plant yields, ability for crops to grow in certain environments, especially in undeveloped countries, spearheaded agricultural science during his lifetime. By the end of his career, many World Health and Food Science groups credited his research in the saving of over 1 billion lives from starvation. Story 19. Nelson Mandela. Mandela's dedication to ending apartheid in South Africa, his 27 years of imprisonment, and his ability to promote peace and reconciliation after becoming the country's first black president are all examples of extraordinary greatness. He demonstrated courage, humility, and an unwavering commitment to justice, inspiring millions worldwide. Story 20. At some point tens of thousands of years ago, there was a hominid who lacked a rational fear of fire, and as such began to play with it. That was the greatest human to have ever lived, as they would have the most greats preceding any grandparent designation. Story 21. Hire an executive assistance service. Tell them to talk to a bunch of wealth assistance services and collate information on recommended legal firms and accounting firms for newly wealthy individuals, and compare and contrast those firms in a summary document for me. Decide which legal and accounting firms to hire, and get the EA service to hire them for me, and get me direct contact details. Not including religious figures, I would say Aristotle. His contributions are still felt today and impacted so many different fields. Father of Western philosophy, father of formal logic, invented syllogistic reasoning, father of biology, zoology, classified over 500 species, foundational towards the development of argumentation, ethos, pathos, and logos, significant contributions to literature and poetics, laid initial groundwork for psychology, developed the ethical framework for virtue ethics, tutored Alexander the Great. Story 22. Buddha was pretty amazing if the stories are true. I'm not a Buddhist, but you kind of have to be impressed with a guy who was promised to either be a great conqueror or an enlightened being and chose the peaceful route. He was a prince and left it behind to wander in poverty and find enlightenment. He did abandon his family, but I'm pretty sure they were pretty well cared for. Story 23. Buddha was pretty amazing if the stories are true. I'm not a Buddhist, but you kind of have to be impressed with a guy who was promised to either be a great conqueror or an enlightened being and chose the peaceful route. He was a prince and left it behind to wander in poverty and find enlightenment. He did abandon his family, but I'm pretty sure they were pretty well cared for. Story 24, I'm clearly biased, but I think he objectively deserves a mention on this list. Mustafa Kemal Ataturk was a young army lieutenant in the crumbling Ottoman Empire. He saw that the padishah, equivalent of king or emperor, giving away land to invading forces out of cowardice, he created a militia from the farmers all around the country to fight back invasion when the official army wouldn't. He won critical battles and ousted the padishah to establish a democratic government. He baked secular rule into the constitution, preventing future governments from turning to Islamic rule, even though he was a Muslim himself. He made actual Turkish language the official language of the country, came up with new Turkish alphabet based on the Latin alphabet instead of the Arabic, established free schools all over the country so people could go learn to read and write, increasing literacy to 90+% almost overnight. He made sure women had the right to vote, one of the first countries to do so in Europe. He obligated both boys and girls to attend school at least up to a certain age. He built factories because he believed a country needed to own its resources. He brought academics, researchers, and professors to Turkey to establish universities and try to make Turkey a leader in science and arts. His adopted daughter, Sabiha Gökçen, is the first female Turkish pilot. He pretty single-handedly established a whole country and based its foundations on secularism, equality, education, and production. Story 25, Gotta Go with Jesus. This man had no degrees, and people called him teacher. Had no servants, people called him master. Had no medicine, yet people called him healer. Won no military battles, yet kings feared him. He was buried in a tomb, and he still lives today. Story 26. Ignác Semmelweis, a Hungarian doctor who worked as a chief physician of the obstetrics department of the St. Rochus Hospital from 1851 in Pest, pointed out the benefits of aseptic, infection-preventing procedures in obstetrics and surgery. He figured out that students and colleges were touching patients just after working with dead people, without hand-washing. He tried to spread his views both through his practice and his writings, but unfortunately, the medical community ignored him at the time. Later on, this practice was in place everywhere eventually, and only God knows how many patients and newborns have been saved since as a result of that. Story 27, Terry Fox. Terry Fox was a Canadian athlete and cancer research activist best known for his remarkable Marathon of Hope. Born on July 28, 1958, in Winnipeg, Manitoba, and raised in Port Coquitlam, British Columbia, Fox was diagnosed with osteosarcoma, a type of bone cancer, at the age of 18. As a result, his right leg was amputated above the knee. Despite this, Fox was determined to raise awareness and funds for cancer research. In 1980, he began his cross-country marathon, running on a prosthetic leg. Fox's goal was to run across Canada from St. John's, Newfoundland, to Vancouver, British Columbia, covering 26 miles a day to symbolize the length of a marathon. Although his run was cut short after 143 days and 5,373 kilometers, 3,339 miles, due to the spread of cancer to his lungs, Fox's legacy endures. He passed away on June 28, 1981, but his efforts have inspired millions. The annual Terry Fox Run continues to raise millions of dollars for cancer research worldwide. Fox is celebrated as a Canadian hero and an icon of perseverance and hope. Story 28, Robert Smalls. Robert Smalls was an enslaved man who bravely piloted a Confederate ship through a Union blockade during the Civil War, effectively escaping slavery and delivering the ship to the Union forces, becoming a symbol of resistance and a powerful advocate for civil rights during Reconstruction-era politics. He later served in the U.S. House of Representatives as a representative from South Carolina. Story 29, Islamic Prophet Muhammad. Michael H. Hart's famous book of the 100 Most Influential People. He has Prophet Muhammad as number 1, followed by Jesus as number 2. I frankly agree with him. I'm not going to yap what he did, but I'll say a couple things. Muhammad brought women's right at a time where it was shame for noble men to have a daughter. So those men would kill their daughters or get rid of them after birth. He brought Islam with him, which is the fastest growing religion. He has one of the best political systems, where the founding fathers of America took inspiration from most of laws, and they even found a Quran in their studies. Also, there are more scientific facts he preached, and today, 21st century, we are discovering it. Story 30. Arguably the most influential is going to be someone like Jesus Christ, Genghis Khan, or Alexander the Great, depending on how you measure their influence during their lives and after their deaths. And one might say if we are going to say Jesus, then we should include Muhammad, PBUH. But Jesus had 1,500 years head start, so there is that. Story 31. There are many criterias for greatest. Here are my picks. Stanislav Petrov. He prevented Soviet Russia from launching a nuclear response due to false alarm. Chengiz Khan. He is the ruler who conquered the largest amount of land in the history of the world, and better than Alexander the Great, as the former inherited an empire from his amazing father as well. The latter, though, united the tribes, beat Chinese empires, defeated Russian tribes, and entered Europe. His legacy is so vast that most of Asia and Eastern Europe is influenced by him. Even India was eventually influenced, despite not being conquered directly. Also, it was under him that the largest number of humans were killed as well. So he was definitely the most powerful human being at some point. Prince Henry the Navigator. He is the one who kicked off the modern age of exploration. He is the giant over whom all explorers stand, and because of whom our whole world was connected. Through that, we can attribute colonialism to him as well. For some time, President Harry S. Truman might be the greatest human in the world. He was the only person with the power to unleash the most terrible and most powerful weapon the world has ever known. Neil Armstrong. The first man to reach the moon. That man was the first to go further than any man-woman had gone before, and took steps and share that with a very limited number of people. He was supported by great people. Oh, get it. But he was the one up there in the moon. Shout out to Buzz Aldrin as well. Sergei Korolev. If Neil Armstrong is the man who went on the moon, Sergei Korolev is the giant over whom the entire space community stands. He was responsible for so many achievements and breakthroughs, it's impossible to list them down. Sir Isaac Newton. If we gather all the scientists, old and new, and you ask me who is the greatest of all of them, I'd say Newton every single time. Newton single-handedly defined classical physics, and it took 200 years for a new branch developed to explain fundamental laws of nature, and they both were for things either too far and large or smaller than molecules, where observation itself messes up the composition. Newton's Principia Mathematica, even if translated, won't be understandable by people who haven't graduated high school in science. And this is 300 years later. He developed integration and differentiation principles just to explain gravity. No doubt that guy tried to convert lead to gold, as if anyone could do it and succeed in the entire human history. It would be him. Louis Pasteur. He validated germ theory and for the first time in history allowed humans to successfully combat diseases, not through natural selection, but genuine scientific progress. Also a mention to Hippocrates, Sushruta, John Bell, and Joseph Lister. George Mendeleev. He created a table and said, well, you know all the elements in the world. Well, it follows a structure. There is a pattern here. And my God, if he didn't find that pattern and change chemistry and science forever. Story 32. I believe the most underrated impact on our world today, and likely someone those in the future will see in history, as someone who set us up at a turning point, was the W. Edwards Deming. His advancement of statistical control and employee empowerment was the key to the U.S. winning WW2. Without his impact, we could likely live in a Nazi-ruled world. After the war, his efforts in rebuilding Japan and setting the groundwork for Six Sigma, Lean, Agile, affect everything we do from electronics to consumer goods software. Unfortunately, his incredible impact contributed to saving the world, and then the U.S. rejected his ideas as they smelled suspiciously Marxist, empowering employees to think at work and create experiments and do analysis to design better solutions to their work. Fortunately, the Japanese embraced the ideology and used it to rebuild their nation, and within 25 years became the second biggest economy in the world. Story 33. It is obviously a very personal question because it calls for a single decision based entirely on opinion. With that in mind, I have to say my grandmother. She may not have cured cancer or discovered gravity, but she was the one who made sure I survived the unthinkable. To me, she was the greatest. I live every day trying to come in second. Story 34. Greatest doesn't necessarily mean good or best. It could be interpreted as meaning achieving the most within their lifetime. A good example of this might be Alexander the Great, who gained his title and fame by conquering people, presumably against their will, which frankly isn't very nice. On that basis, I'd have to nominate Genghis Khan. The man was a monster, but I think he sets the limits for what one person can achieve in their lifetime. I can't think of any one person who comes even remotely close. His family was ejected from their tribe after the death of his father, when he was just a young boy, abandoned on the bleak Mongolian steppes with just the clothes they were wearing and W. his mother had in her pockets. He built his own tribe from scratch, then used it to conquer annex the other steppe tribes, creating a nation. He then turned that nation into probably the finest and most effective military force that has ever existed. Then he set about absolutely humiliating any nation that looked at him funny just because he could, which resulted in the largest contiguous empire in human history, all in the span of a lifetime, compared to the other two go-to greatest empires in history, the Roman and the British, both of which took multiple generations to reach their zenith. He's pretty much the most agentic individual who ever lived. That is to say, someone who displays agency in their own life. Con Iggulden did a pretty good series of biographical novels on him if you're looking for a good read. Story 35. I have multiple in mind, but I'm just going to say three. Ferdinand Magellan, Alexander the Great, or Achilles. Magellan was the first one to circumnavigate the Earth. A huge feat, also proving that the Earth was round, not flat. As for Alexander, he came to power at the age of 20 and conquered almost all of the known world at the time in the span of a decade. Achilles was the greatest warrior who ever lived. There you go, greatest warrior. He was given a choice to either die young and become a legend, which is why we're still talking about him now 3,000 years later, or die old and be forgotten to history. Story 36, I won't say the greatest because there are a lot of great people, but it's fascinating how much Nikola Tesla shaped the world. The world around you literally came from his creative imagination and the drive to not give up no matter how wild your aspirations. He foresaw the internet, the digital world, the electrical advancement of the Industrial Revolution, and laid the groundwork for all these things to come to fruition. Amazing how one man and his determination can accomplish so much, just believing in himself and making a path where there was none. Story 37. Sir Nicholas Winton for me. He saved the lives of 669 endangered children by smuggling them out of Czechoslovakia and into the UK during World War II. If I remember correctly, he never mentioned what he had done, and it wasn't until someone found a book with the names of the kids in it he had saved that he even talked about it. Story 38, I'm going to go a different direction and say Fred Rogers. He didn't have any scientific discoveries or create any new inventions, but he gave and taught kindness, acceptance, encouragement, empathy, and love to generations of children, many of whom, like myself, came from very difficult circumstances, and he helped us learn to love ourselves and our neighbors, and showed us how to be better human beings. He was a light in the darkness for so many of us, and I'd say that makes him great. Story 39, Ignaz Semmelweis. A Hungarian physician and scientist of German descent who was an early pioneer of antiseptic procedures and was described as the savior of mothers. Despite his research, Semmelweis's observations conflicted with the established scientific and medical opinions of the time, and his ideas were rejected by the medical community. He could offer no theoretical explanation for his findings of reduced mortality due to hand washing, and some doctors were offended at the suggestion that they should wash their hands and mocked him for it. In 1865, the increasingly outspoken Semmelweis allegedly suffered a nervous breakdown and was committed to an asylum by his colleagues. In the asylum, he was beaten by the guards. He died 14 days later from a gangrenous wound on his right hand that may have been caused by the beating. His findings earned widespread acceptance only years after his death, when Louis Pasteur confirmed the germ theory, giving Semmelweis's observations a theoretical explanation, and Joseph Lister, acting on Pasteur's research, practiced and operated using hygienic methods with great success. Story 40. I feel like Jesus deserves a shout, either the savior of mankind if you're a Christian, a great prophet if you're Muslim, the most famous Jew if you are Jewish, and if you are an atheist, he is the greatest, more successful cult leader to ever live. You cannot beat over 2,000 years of legacy spread across the entire planet with essentially everyone still knowing who you are. Keep in mind he lived in essentially a time where history and details were scarce, so for his legacy to be still going is pretty amazing as the vast majority of the population could not read nor write. Story 41. Paul McCartney has got to be in the running. He's lived his entire life on the strength of his talents, promoting love and good vibes with nary a scandal. Enjoyed the swinging 60s, married a good woman, and raised a healthy family. And he continues to travel the world entertaining sold-out stadia into his 80s. He absolutely rode the crest of humanity's greatest wave, technologically, spiritually, and economically. Is he perfect? No, but he has got to have lived one of the best human lives ever. Story 42. It's tough to pinpoint one person as the greatest, but many would argue for figures like Mahatma Gandhi for his impact on nonviolent resistance, or Albert Einstein for his contributions to science. Others might point to influential leaders like Nelson Mandela for his fight for equality. Ultimately, it depends on what qualities you value most: compassion, intellect, or innovation. Who do you think stands out? Story 43. James Blunt and his alleged prevention of W3 by refusing to obey a direct order had his superior okayed the command by an American NATO general to forcibly take a Kosovo airport from the Russians in 1999 is one of the old Top Gear's best anecdotes for a celebrity guest who drove their reasonably priced car around their Dunsfold track. Story 44, Jim Henson, but you can probably see that one incredibly biased from my PFFP. I don't think there could ever be a person with more passion for puppetry and its expansive use for education and entertainment. Henson didn't just care about Sesame Street and children. He made it his goal to make puppetry for everyone. The Muppet Show was something the whole family could sit down for and enjoy. And despite moments of adult humor, it was never crass or inappropriate. Maybe the only thing to go against that is the name of the second pilot, so they'd get across it's not just a kid's show. The Muppets, sex and violence, El Mao. He was also one of the most accepting people, and despite his achievements, he was always pushing the other Muppeteers in front of him. Henson went to puppetry conventions regularly, even after the success of most of his shows and movies, specifically looking for young talent and women. There were barely any female puppeteers at the time. Look to the early history of who voiced female characters for your answer. I'll save you the search. It was mostly Frank Oz. But he'd go specifically looking for women to give these characters to. Not to mention one of his best friends, Richard Hunt, who delivered the eulogy at his memorial service, was an openly gay man with AIDS/HIV. And Kevin Clash, the original performer for Elmo, was also a black gay man. He hired and supported these people through the height of the AIDS epidemic and beyond. They were his friends and nothing else. Story 45. Despite being a non-believer in religion, I would have to give this to the people who shaped our world today. Arguably, Jesus Christ left the biggest legacy along with Buddha, the Prophet Muhammad, and other such representatives of today's religions and beliefs. They gave people hope, morals, a purpose in life, and many, many more things that shaped our world until today and is still going on. I don't think anything can beat this. Story 46. Lots of incredible, generous people here, but I'm going to go for greatest in terms of the human who made the absolute most out of life. This person makes Hunter S. Thompson look boring. Tycho Brahe was an absolute legend. One of the more boring things he did was import a pet moose from North America and keep it drunk most of the time. Story 47 depends on what qualifies the greatest person ever. Napoleon and Julius Caesar probably contend with each other for the achievement of being the most competent human beings ever, the most genius and competent doers of things in history. That's what comes to mind immediately when I think greatest, the most competent and capable human ever. The most influential person ever is undoubtedly Plato, with no competition or doubt at all if that's the road to go down. If it's the most morally good or virtuous person, then it gets tricky. Story 48. You reading this right now. Maybe you haven't defeated world hunger or saved people from a terrible fate, but you keep trucking in this dystopian nightmare we live in. So yeah, you're pretty great, the greatest even, especially if you have a cat. Story 49. Fritz Haber is definitely complicated and has some negatives to go with his positives, but the discovery of the Haber process, which allows the industrial production of ammonia and thus fertilizer, makes him probably the person who has affected the most human lives in history, since without his discovery, we would not be able to feed anywhere close to 8 billion people. Story 50. Henrietta Lacks, maybe Shaka Zulu? Spitballing. I'm not sure what the criteria are for the greatest human ever. Looks like seemingly permanently affecting the lives of future children across the world. I would say those who've affected the greatest number of bloodlines across all species, flinging as many bloodlines as humanly possible into a permanent and continually progressive, unalterable trajectory. Eden or Armageddon. Story 51. My grandfather, who I never got to meet, my uncle, married in, 2 cousins, other side of the family, and my husband all have had type 1 diabetes. On the 23rd of January 1923, Banting, Collip, and Best were awarded U.S. patents on insulin and the method used to make it. They all sold these patents to the University of Toronto for $1 each. Banting famously said, "Insulin does not belong to me, it belongs to the world." He wanted everyone who needed it to have access to it. Story 52. All right, I'll throw him in for accomplishments, but not for personality. Fritz Haber is probably the reason you are alive today. The Haber-Bosch process, which synthesizes ammonia, is the reason crop yields have ever been able to get large enough to feed the current world population. To this very day, ammonia produced from this process provides fertilizer that feeds roughly half the world. Before this process, the population cap for the world was estimated to be 2 billion people. He also made bad gas weapons for Germany in W1 and was a bad father and husband. His wife shot herself in the heart over his war inventions. But in terms of sheer number of people alive due to his actions, he probably is the top person. Story 53 celebrity-wise, I'd say Jackie Chan is certainly up there as a kind, passionate, hard-working individual. He just seems like the type of person who would never hurt a fly, only choosing to hurt the bad guys in his films. Sure, there's plenty of philanthropists and medical doctors whose names I don't know, so maybe Jackie isn't the greatest, but he's way up there when compared to me and most people I know. Story 54. Too easy. The Swiss chemist Albert Hofmann is responsible for helping countless people unlock their true potential and experiencing this world for what it truly is, not to mention giving us such great music as Pink Floyd and the Beatles. We all owe this wonderful human being a true debt of gratitude. Story 55. My grandpa, Omaha Beach. Spoke a little German, so was used as a spy, almost died so many times. He was 16, snuck his way into the war, was then on a tank crew and had every other dude die in his arms. German officers housed to get intel and hide behind a couch for hours because they came home and had a meeting. Finally won the war and almost got killed by a woman at the parade by a little pistol because he felt her press it into his back, etc. Just absolutely nuts to think about it. He was a hard ass and scared the out of me as a kid, but told us all his stories and died 15 years ago. I cried holding his hand at the end, and he told me with some of his last breaths to be good. That guy is the greatest human and my hero. Story 56. Fred Rogers, Mr. Rogers. Hear me out. If Mr. Rogers walked into Congress today, 2020, 2010, 2000, 1990, 1980, 1970, 1960, and he needed something, it would get done. The man was so good. If he told you he was disappointed in your actions, You would probably cry in shame, but he would never do that. He was too busy bringing people together, teaching kids that they matter, that their feelings mattered. My kids knew of Daniel Tiger from their youth. We put on Mr. Rotors and they all made their way in to sit and watch. They didn't understand the draw at first. It was beautiful. I believe he could have done so much more, but what he did from a public access channel was nothing short of amazing. Story 57. He hasn't been mentioned yet, but Alan Turing basically is responsible for the entirety of the modern world as we know it, having been the first person to make a computer which was entirely programmable. A computer is not considered a computer unless it's Turing complete. Imagine there exists an alternate universe where he was never born, and we have yet to invent computers at all. Story 58. Florence Nightingale. She was a pioneering British nurse who revolutionized both the role of nursing and the field of medicine. Her practices, focus on sanitation and dedication to improving hospital conditions, laid the foundation for modern nursing. Through her teaching and reform efforts, she permanently changed the world of healthcare for the better, saving countless lives and setting new standards of care. Story 59. My grandparents, the most outstanding people I have ever met. My mama has Parkinson's and Papa has leukemia, but their conditions never limit their compassion for others and who they are as people. I am honored to take care of them in their final years, especially after all they have done for me and so many others. Their 60th wedding anniversary is on the 10th, and they are still as much in love as when they first met. Story 60. I see a lot of scientists being named. We all stand on the shoulders of giants. These inventions, these ideas, wouldn't exist without the ideas that preceded them. They are like building blocks. The collective scientific discipline is probably the greatest and most important feature of humanity. To name one person is to discredit all the hard work that went into a single invention idea pioneered by another. That's not to say some theories have been highly intelligent and novel. I also note no one is mentioning anyone for amassing the most wealth. Story 61. Dr. Sanduk Ruit is an optometrist who went to North Korea with one mission: to restore sight to the blind. On his original trip, he was able to surgically remove cataracts from 10,000 people. He then taught his techniques to the doctors there and left equipment so that his work could continue after he left. Knowing there would be no way to repay him, he also did this all for free. Ultimately, his methods restored the sight of not 10,000 but 100,000. Story 62. Jesus of Nazareth, second person of the Trinity, creator of the universe, humbled himself by becoming human, hypostatic union. Savior of humanity because he died for sin and raised to life that we might have eternal life with him. King of kings and Lord of lords who is coming back to reign and will wipe away every tear in his eternal kingdom. Story 63. Possibly Ramses II. He's one of the only figure in the Bible we know was literally a historical person. He built more temples in ancient Egypt than any other pharaoh. He was the most powerful ruler of the New Kingdom, arguably the most powerful leader of the ancient world. He ruled over an empire that included Syria, Nubia, Canaan, Phoenicia, basically the entire Levant region. Story 64. Alan Turing. He broke Nazi codes during World War II that helped save millions of lives and shorten the war by cluing the Allied forces into important Nazi strategy and movements. Unfortunately, this has been overlooked for a long time because he also happened to be gay and at the time, after the war was over, was severely punished for this, leading him to eventually take his own life. He deserved so much more. A great movie about him is The Imitation Game. Story 65. My parents. My father is a paramedic who routinely puts his life in danger to save others, and his idea of a day off is doing work around the house to fix it up or keep everyone comfortable. Truly the type of person who'd give you the shirt off his back. I have never met a human who works so hard in absolutely everything that he does, with absolutely no desire for fame or thanks, truly selfless. My mother was severely abused as a child in an extremely impoverished household. She had to choose between college textbooks and food. She has since become an accomplished teaching specialist and has won awards from the state. She had an emotional breakdown because she felt like she had failed hundreds of students when she realized that some people don't think in visuals, despite the awards and success she's had, bringing students from nearly lost cause levels of failing to passing. And with all of that, they both gave everything to me and my sister. They encouraged us to follow our dreams, even when they seemed impossible. Truly my heroes. Story 66. Julius Caesar beside the calendar, social politics to tax the rich in favor of the plebe, politic to oblige to hire a minimum amount of Roman citizens at a minimum wage defined as permitting to maintain a family, lowering the amount of money needed to access prestigious public roles. The many public works he promoted were personally overlooked by him, so in a way he was the first project manager. I know he was having a slightly more power, and the people stealing or supplying materials of low quality were not granted a fair process before being put to death. Last but not least, he got rid of many useless civilizations. Story 67, Paul McCartney. While not doing exceptionally humanities stuff like others you guys already named here, well, at least he's vegetarian. He is the greatest modern music talent of the last century and influenced so much that not only his and the Beatles' music is a gift, but also many other artists I enjoy that would never exist without him. This guy was part of the greatest songwriter duo with John Lennon of history, helped the Beatles becoming the greatest band of all time, had a more than decent decade spanning solo career, and literally created music genres, especially with his contributions to the White Album. I wish he would just clone himself to have another lifetime to make music, seriously. Story 68, Plato, Socrates, Confucius, and related philosophers changed the world from being one where everyone believed it's fair for the stronger one to take from the weaker to one based on morals and ethics from an idealized place. Changed the world's perspective on what it means to be happy and live a good life. Story 69. There was an Austrian painter born in the 1800s that really doesn't get the credit he deserves, but love him or him, his work was visionary and ahead of his time, and his influence ripples through society today. Oskar Kokoschka needs more recognition. Story 70, Mario Lanza. Man was the reason Elvis and Soviet Elvis Magomayev both connected and married their wives. He is the reason Pavarotti, Bocelli, Domingo started singing opera. Maria Callas named him the greatest tenor. He looked like God, sang like God, and influenced the world as a god in a human form could do. Story 71, well, if you mean sheer feats done, they're Heisteen. This will bring PTSD to CK3 players. He raided all around the Mediterranean, sacked the heavily fortified city of Luna by tricking the defenders into letting him in for a Christian burial by pretending to die of natural causes, and then slaughtered the defenders after inviting his forces to his funeral, raided Spain. Might be why Hastings is called Hastings. Killed the father of Robert Eudes, helped Brittany beat a superior French force, beat up the French with only his own forces, sacked Morocco, South France. He started out at North France and went all the way around the Mediterranean, sailed downriver from Luna, raided Pisa, and may have gotten as far Byzantine territories in Greece, brought multiple African slaves on his way back and sold them to the Irish, sacked Pamplona, occupied Angers, occupied Milton Regis, beat up the Welsh. We then lost track of him. Story 72. For contributions to science and technology, there's 100 Darwin, Fleming, Hawking, Einstein, and many more. But if you're on about people that stopped evil, there are only two, Winston Churchill and Alan Turing. Churchill chose to go to war with the Nazis when everyone else in Parliament was ready to surrender, and Turing basically ended the war years earlier with his enigma-breaking machine. Story 73. This is such a tough question, but I'd argue that Mahatma Gandhi deserves serious recognition. His commitment to nonviolence and peaceful resistance changed the course of history and inspired countless movements for civil rights around the world. His ability to lead through love and compassion rather than aggression truly sets him apart. While many have made significant contributions, Gandhi's philosophy continues to resonate and influence people today. Story 74, to have ever lived, IDK. In my short and recent lifetime, Emo John Trudell, Alireza Panahian, Hassan Nasrallah, just to name a few, who what they have in common is they lived by always being advocates against oppression and were some of the greatest speakers of our time. I urge you all to look up at least one speech by each of these great men, even with English subtitles, although knowing the original language does hit different.